Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katie Wilmus, and I am a Public Program Coordinator at the National Archives. And I'd like to welcome you to the second edition of the National Archives Expert Series, which today happens to fall on the exact anniversary of our founding. So happy 75th birthday to the National Archives today. I'd like to encourage you to attend our upcoming programs to continue our celebration of our anniversary, and these are listed in the program guide on this side. I'd also like to call your attention to our comment form, and if you have a moment just to let us know what you think of the program, we'd really appreciate it. And the comment boxes are on this table as you exit the building. And now I'd like to introduce Rick Blondo, who is a management and program analyst from the Space and Security Management Division, to talk about the history of this National Archives building. I'd also like to point out that if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the history of the building, that the Foundation for the National Archives will be publishing a nice book about it in the fall. So you can look for that this coming fall, and it will probably be sold in our archives shop. So now I'd like to turn it over to Rick Blondo.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you all for having the interest in coming out today. I must say I'm a bit embarrassed to be given the title expert today. I'll just say I'm not a stuffy expert, and my talk today is going to be rather informal. It's going to be heavily influenced by graphics, which you'll see up on screen, and it's really a series of short stories that I've just thrown together to kind of pump as much information in you about the history of this amazing building. My first 3 National Archives jobs were not here in this building, and I always wondered if I'd ever have a job that took me to this building. And it turns out my 4th job was to renovate the building. And so I was here for 7 years, living in the basement, but throughout the entire space, managing the effort to help the staff cope with the noise and the dust and the smells and all that happened during a renovation, because the building stayed open during those years and was also open to the public as well. A few of the slides you'll see today touch upon the renovation as well. I do intend to leave some time at the end for some questions, and Katie was nice enough to tell me that this is being recorded and eventually it's going to be posted on the web. So it will live on beyond this moment we have together. Any audience shots? Probably not. So if you want to be captured for posterity, make sure your hand's in front of the screen at some point. The National Archives building is filled with federal records that document the American experience. There are myriad stories in those records, and today I'm here to tell you stories about this place, this temple to Clio. Franklin Roosevelt said in this at the dedication of his library in Hyde Park, New York, "To bring together the records of the past and to house them in buildings where they will be preserved for the use of men and women in the future, a nation must believe in 3 things. It must believe in the past. It must believe in the future. It must, above all, believe in the capacity of its own people, so to learn from the past that they gain judgment in creating their own future." Franklin Roosevelt was really like the patron saint of the National Archives. He was very interested in this building being built, and his memorial is right outside the Pennsylvania Avenue door at the corner of 9th and Pennsylvania. Bill Moyer says this about history: "The past is no row of bare facts waiting to be memorized by school children, nor does it stand in our backyard like an old picket fence, slowly and silently rotting. The past is a real world, inhabited by villains and heroes and regular folk passing this way on swift journeys. Their story is our story, the tie that binds each generation to all the others." Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now visit the National Archives building in 1940.
In Washington, the beautiful Archives building stands as a living memorial to the patriots who made and preserved our democracy. It contains the living record of their great works. Two fine statues guard the approach. They represent heritage and vigilance. Americans of the past, men who considered their everyday job to be the furtherance and preservation of our democracy, might well have nodded their heads in solemn approval as a sculptor's chisel cut these words in the living rock. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, a warning that our heritage of freedom and liberty must be preserved. At a gesture from the guard, the largest bronze doors in the world swing slowly inward. Some idea of their size can be gauged by the towering Corinthian columns. This magnificent entrance leads directly to the exhibition hall, where two great works by the American mural painter Barry Faulkner mark milestones of American history. Here, Thomas Jefferson and his committee present the Declaration of Independence to the Continental Congress. A new America strikes its first united blow for freedom. The Declaration of Independence was the great plan on which this nation is founded. The Constitution is the supporting pillar of our democracy. Here, James Madison offers the Constitution of the United States to George Washington and the members of the historic Constitutional Convention. Within the exhibition hall, school book history comes to life as a visitor sees documents which mark steps in the forward march of America. Among the important treaties here preserved is the First Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812 and reaffirmed our nation's right to live in peace and freedom. Another represents a battle fought and won on the field of diplomacy. Its parchment yellowed, its ink faded. It is preserved as a vital link in our democracy, forged when America took its place in the Congress of Nations. This seemingly unimportant document is actually the acknowledgement by Great Britain in 1783 that her colonies are now the United States of America. This famous Treaty of Paris bears the signatures of three great Americans, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay. The historian or scholar seeking facts, or the plain citizen seeking a knowledge of his government, heads for this nerve center of the archives, the search room. Here, documents are cross-cataloged for easy access. R.D.W. Connor, appointed by the President as Archivist of the United States, is in direct control of the entire building and supervises the wide variety of activities of the 400 members of the archive staff. For years, the vital papers and documents of the United States were scattered throughout the city of Washington, in basements and dead files of various buildings and departments. Under this haphazard system, no one knew for certain where anything was, what was of vital importance and what was worthless. Finally, Congress stepped in, and in 1934 passed legislation creating the National Archives. The Archives building became the consolidating force to bring order out of chaos. Here, in the Division of Repair and Preservation, the historical records of our government shed the dust of their years and are transformed and preserved as a precious heritage. Trundled on special trucks, our vital state papers take their first step from shoddy obscurity. In these large fumigating tanks, all papers entering the custody of the National Archives are placed for more than 3 hours, science making sure that all organic life is destroyed. Now the documents are carefully removed from the fumigating tanks, checked as to condition, and pass on to the next step. Experts, using specially devised machines, remove by compressed air every particle of dust and dirt which long years of neglect and oblivion have deposited. The stream of air even pries in between pages, separating brittle sheets more delicately than human hands. When the Archives building was first opened, these men had to wear gas masks to protect themselves from the dust. Now, each table is equipped with specially designed suction fans, by means of which the dust-laden air is conveyed to a filtering system, enabling the experts to work under healthful and comfortable conditions. Cleaned and sterilized, the manuscripts and books go to the desks of expert binders. With their trained hands and specially adapted tools, these highly skilled men separate pages and perhaps see for the first time in 100 years some document of state signed by John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, or one of the many other great patriots who figured prominently in the establishment of our liberty. The tender care with which these men handle the documents shows how extremely fragile many of these old papers are. It is often necessary to employ humidifying processes before further treatment is possible, after which, under carefully controlled heat and pressure, the papers are smoothed and the faded ink is made more vivid, easier to read. This is known as the ironing process, necessary for the flat filing of records. This important work of reconditioning state documents, some already in a dangerously poor state of preservation, goes on behind the scenes. But everyone who uses the archive sees the results of the meticulous care exercised. Here, papers are being bound in their individual jackets of cellulose acetate so that they may be examined and studied closely without fear of injury. In fact, use of this cellulose acetate in many instances reduces the thickness of records and improves the legibility of the original. The cellulose acetate is completely transparent. Thin sheets are placed on the front and back of each document, after which they are placed on the bed of these specially designed presses. Here, under thousands of pounds of pressure and intense heat, the cellulose acetate and the document are forever wedded. Now the record, regardless of its former state, can be used without fear of further deterioration. These documents are copied by photostat. A direct copy in actual size is made on durable photographic paper. These photostats may be studied and handled without fear of damage, while the original rests safely in the vault. But with some larger exhibits, photostatting is not practical. With items such as newspapers, a new and revolutionary technique is used, microphotography. Someday, perhaps through the use of this film technique, every school child in the land will see at first hand the state documents which have heretofore been only drab quotations of text. Besides preserving the written and printed memorabilia of the United States, the Archives has undertaken to perpetuate the spoken word through recordings and the visual documents of progress through motion pictures. Here, in fireproof vaults, ventilated by controlled, conditioned air, are stored thousands of feet of important films. Trained technicians maintain this film laboratory, selecting and editing all films before they're filed away in the vaults. These pictures are available to any responsible citizen upon the fulfillment of certain necessary requirements. Through the use of motion pictures, the Archives is taking full advantage of science in keeping records of the social and cultural life of America as it progresses. In the motion pictures is preserved an active mirror of our country's history in the making. In the sound department, the recorded utterances of our nation's leaders are carefully preserved. Tomorrow's younger generation will have not only pictures of our president, they will hear him speak.
Eleanor Roosevelt, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
With its great storage vaults, exhibition halls, manuscripts, documents, and papers, the Archives building is truly a time capsule of Americana from the earliest beginnings of our democracy to the present day. It houses the significant highlights of the country's history. This paper, Ratification of Our Constitution, is a mute reminder of that dramatic moment in modern history when the voices of 13 original states were raised as one, proclaiming to the world our independence. Abraham Lincoln speaks out from these pages. This is the proclamation which granted freedom to the slaves, vitally significant in the history of mankind's patient plodding toward a higher life. The Bill of Rights of the Constitution, ensuring the right to free speech, free assemblage, free religion. Another reminder of the basic principles on which our America has grown strong. Here are the truths which give force, body, and strength to the words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
We no longer iron records. We no longer use cellulose acetate. We still do microfilming, I think, but it's on its way out. Yes, I'm getting a yes. But I thought it was interesting that microphotography was described in the same way the internet is today, that you can get documents in the hands of school children across the country easily. Some of those book trucks are still in this building. I'm not sure they're used, but I've seen a few of them. You're looking here at a photo of a newborn. This is the National Archives building before the landscaping was put in. So you'll notice the behind the limestone statues here, there's no magnolia trees. They hadn't been planted yet. And here they are. This is a photo that was taken circa 1998, just before the renovation began, at sunrise. It's one of my favorite pictures of the building because it has an orange cast to it. It's taken by Earl MacDonald, Norris photographer. And this is the current standard image that's used for the building, post-renovation. We had to get permission to remove 3 magnolia trees behind each of the statue groupings to put in the walkways that allow entrance into the building. And John Russell Pope, the building's architect, specified that that kind of green backdrop be part of the look of the building, so those statues had a nice background to be against. There's granite, in the lower part of the building, and Indiana limestone throughout the rest of it. I have a piece of that granite here. Pope originally conceptualized that the entire building be clad in this granite, and it wound up eventually not happening. We'll get more about that a little bit later. I also want you to remember this image right here, the top of the roof of the pediment. You'll see why a little bit further into the presentation today. Anybody here from California? Anybody here been to San Diego? There's a place called Legoland in San Diego, which has a Washington, D.C. section, and I'm amazed at how they were able to replicate our building. Be hard-pressed to tell. You're not looking at the real thing. Before the building was situated here, there was a place called Center Market. And as part of the renovation, there was excavation that took place on the south side of the building for the theater, and there were remnants of Center Market that were dug up, including, from its demolition, including a marble piece of countertop, oyster shells, some poor animal's bone that was somebody's lunch one day. I have a box here at the end of the table filled with these little oddities. If any of you have time afterwards, you're welcome to look at it. This was the largest market in Washington, D.C., and it was removed to make way for what came to be known as the Federal Triangle. And you can see it nicely delineated here with our building literally halfway between the Capitol building along Pennsylvania Avenue and the White House. In the original plan for the development of the Federal Triangle, which here is this area, the Justice Department building was going to be situated where our building currently is, and the Archives building next door. John Russell Pope, who was a member of the commission to develop the Federal Triangle buildings, recognized that there was a symbolic significance to this site on a cross-access of the mall. Here's the what's now the Smithsonian Art Museum. It used to be the Patent Building. I have this quirk. I remember the first letter of a word, and then I have to fill it in the rest. So I'm always stumbling whether that's pension or patent, but the Patent Building. Here's the plan as it wound up being built, with our building in its current location and Justice next door. And this building at the other end of the cross-access. And here's a photograph of the same scene. Does anybody know what this building is? Because I have no idea, and I haven't researched it yet. But it's a major building, and it's on the cross-access. So it must have been important in its day. I don't think it's there anymore. So, Center Market was demolished, and here's the beginning of the construction of the foundation of this building. You can see the dome of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. First thing that was done besides the pilings put in was concrete poured to create what's now the sub-basement of this building, which in effect is the foundation of the building. And then it started to rise up. John Russell Pope designed a dry moat to surround the building. I was not able to find any documentation what its intended purpose was. I assume it was to collect water from periodic flood events so that the building itself would be undamaged. And here again you see granite up to that height, the steps on Constitution Avenue being formed. This is a September 1933 photograph of the skeleton of the building rising. And a half year later, it's looking almost finished. I love the trolley car. If that's what I think it is, that's the corner of Pennsylvania and 7th Street. All right, bunch of news clips. I want you just to focus on the headlines because that's what you can easily read. Archivists tend to have the reputation of being pencil neck geeks. And there's a reason for that, because there was a guy named Poindexter who introduced the archives bill. That's a joke. He was actually a senator and quite powerful, but I thought it was interesting to see his name there. It's not just people that are overtaxed in Washington, it's also federal buildings, meaning that there were too many records stored in federal buildings and they needed to disgorge, and part of the function of the archives was to be the recipient of those disgorged records. This headline talks about not this building, but an earlier design of the building, which was then thought to be erected around 12th Street in Pennsylvania. It really was an odd design. I'm going to read you this snippet from 50 years before the date of this clipping, this snippet down here, which dates from 1879, The Protection of Archives. The government's need of an archives building to keep the precious records of the federal administration was noted 50 years ago, as from this, the Washington Star of August 20th, 1873. A Chicago contributor to the internecine war writes to this paper, urging the necessity that our public archives should be stored in available fireproof buildings, and sensibly says, the destruction of the titles to all the land in the country sold by the government would alone involve a loss greater than the cost of all Washington City. Let us have done with this humbuggery of capital moving, because back in that time, post-Civil War, there was talk about relocating the capital. And let's build a building suitable for the records. That was 1879, I think I said, 1873, 79. This is an artifact from the past. It's known as a Woodruff box. These were patented in 1884. There used to be literally thousands of these boxes in the stacks of this building. And what a Woodruff box was a filing device. You would get federal records, or any record, but for the purpose of this talk, federal records. Let's say it was a packet of information of about 30 pages, and be folded in on itself like this, and wrapped with red ribbon, which was officially known as red tape. And so if you needed to gain access to the information from a government record, you would cut through the red tape, open up the record, and have access to the information. That's where that phrase comes from. And there's a little compressor tool here, depending on how many records you had in there. These are antiques, needless to say. And in my time at the archives, in the early 1990s, a huge reboxing effort was done, and these things were thrown out, I'll say thousands a day, and because there's a federal law that says you can't personally benefit by federal property. So although staff members really I kept one as a tool to talk to folks like you about it. But I thought it was a sad separation from our past. If you go to the Public Vaults exhibit, you'll see the fronts of several Woodruff boxes that have been put on display there, and that's how they would have looked in office space. And you'd pull the box out and gain access to the records. This one held U.S. Army personal papers from 1901, infantry records. Those weren't good things. They were made out of wood. Wood burns. So does cardboard, for that matter. It's what we have them in now. But it's acid-free cardboard, and it keeps dust out. So it is an improvement. Useless federal records blamed for space lack. That's another way of saying old records that didn't have current value by agencies. I'm going to read you a paragraph right down here. R.W.D. Connor, archivist, was called before the committee, it's a committee of Congress, to explain plans for operating the archives building and the duties of the present 117 employees. Quote, I was up there recently with Mr. Burlow of the Interior Department, said Cochran. He's the chairman of the committee who was dealing with an archives issue at the time. And we found more employees wandering around in the halls than were at their desk. That came out they came out to the corridors and looked at us as though we were a couple of movie celebrities. Later, however, when Connor explained the nature of the work that will have to be done when the project gets fully underway, which is dealing with archival records, Congress wondered how so few employees will be able to handle all of those details. So we're always, staff members here, we're always misunderstood by Congress. John Russell Pope, here's the guy who designed this building. He died in 1937, 2 years after this picture, within a short time after the building officially opened to the public. He also designed the National Gallery of Art, which is catty corner across the street from us, the Jefferson Memorial, many other notable buildings. This is the letter from 1928, where he's just been told he got the job of being of being the architect of this building, and he's very pleased to get it because at that stage of his career, he was heavily into neoclassical look, which was out of favor by that time. And a statement he has here in the letter, all of which, as I say, is most gratifying, and my visit to Delano, who was another architect, most satisfactory, leaving me with the feeling, thanks to you, that I am really no longer a dangerous woman, which meant he was being avoided by his professional peers. This is what he had to say. The importance of a building to contain permanent records of the national government, its association with the monuments of Washington, and its unique and prominent site dictate the design, style, and character of the building. These are several pages of documents that talk in detail about what the archives is all about and this building is all about. I'll read you a little bit from here. From there, one passes through a 13-foot grilled gate into a rotunda, or rather a semicircular hall, planned for the display of documents of particular public interest, placed in display cases. Among the most notable that are now the Treaty of Peace of Great Britain with the United States of 1783, which is known as the Treaty of Paris. The hall is covered by a half-dome ceiling 75 feet above the floor. I've never seen any indication that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were designed for the exhibition hall. I think it's assumed that was the case, but it was probably impolitic to talk about that because we didn't have those documents when the building first opened. The Library of Congress had them, and eventually they were transferred to us. We'll have more about that shortly. This is a photograph that appeared. I'm going to read you in 1931. I'll read you the caption. Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Ferry K. Heath, in charge of the Government Triangle Building Program, breaks ground for the new archives building to be erected at a cost of $8,750,000. The building in College Park, by the way, was budgeted at $250 million and came in under budget and on time, but it shows you how times change, dollar-wise. So this picture appeared in a local paper here in Washington, but it also appeared across the country, in papers across the country, which resulted in the first letter from a genealogist. Annie Walker Burns. I'm reading from here. She's from Kentucky. Dear Sir, she's writing to Heath, the guy with the shovel. In a Middlesboro, Kentucky paper, I noticed a picture where you were in charge of a construction work, lifted the first spade of earth on the site of the new Archives building. I'd like to know where I may obtain a copy of the bill which was passed in Congress and Senate to erect said building, as I desire to obtain the information as to just the nature of records which they are intending to place in same, as I was under the impression that the Library of Congress was supposed to file historical records in their library. For about a year, I've been compiling and arranging in alphabetical order the marriages, births, and deaths of Kentucky families from each county, and she's wanting to know whether this can be placed in the archives. Now, I've done a little bit of family history. Any genealogists here? Yeah, I just love this. Just based on a spade of earth, a query came in about, what do you have that can be useful for family history? I just think it's fantastic. Chiselers in action, but they're sculptors. These are the capitals at the top of the Corinthian columns. The world's largest door on its way here. This is from Pope himself describing the building. The building is in classical style to harmonize with the Capitol, the White House, the Treasury Building, and the Lincoln Memorial. In keeping with the principles of expressing in the architecture the significance and safety of the various records to be deposited in the Archives building, materials for the exterior have been selected with permanence as the paramount consideration. The base of the building from the ground up to the main floor level is of Milford, Massachusetts granite, and the superstructure is of Indiana limestone. This is a photo of the rotunda under construction, with the eagles being carved in place at the top of the capitals. 1935 photograph of the rotunda nearing completion. This is a photo of the rotunda taken shortly before the renovation began. This is the shrine area of the rotunda. Notice the difference. There's similarities, but the difference is the Declaration of Independence was put in an upright case there to mimic the way it was displayed at the Library of Congress. If you were to look at photos of this compared to how the documents were displayed at LC, you'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference. And I think that this was after work that was done in the early 1950s to prepare the rotunda for the Constitution and the Declaration coming to us. And I think part of it was to honor and respect the fact that LC was there to safeguard those documents before we came on the scene. Library of Congress wasn't too keen to get rid of the Declaration and the Constitution. A dear colleague, Milt Gustafson, who passed away a year or two ago, sent me an email, and it included this information about that topic. I checked the quotation from the annual report of the Librarian of Congress. Luther Evans asked David Mearns, chief of the manuscript division, to write 2 to 3 pages for the annual report. This is in the context of transferring the documents to us. Mearns wrote 7 pages of stirring prose, ending with, quote, "Procrustean logic and the inexorable requirement of the law have required the transfer. The retired but retained records of the government must be entrusted to the National Archives. Retired, retained, they will never retire. They must always be retained, but they will be removed." Then Luther Evans sent a poem to Archivist Wayne Grover. "There once was an agency rich whose head had a terrible itch. To take all records over, his name it was Grover, a two-fisted son of a bitch." And Grover responded with poetry of his own. "I have read your effusions, I bleed with remorse. No further contusions will come from this source. But to label us rich is outright deception. Better limit the pitch to unimmaculate conception." I love it. It's a different day. Any idea what you're looking at here? You know. This is the interior of the archives building before the courtyard was infilled with stack space. Do you know what you're literally looking at there? The exterior wall of the rotunda. This is the circular gallery that used to exist around the rotunda. This is Tier 7, where that black band is. And this was the neck of the circular gallery that led to room 105. So all of the circular gallery was demolished to make room for the new permanent exhibit space, but the rotunda was, of course, carefully dealt with during the renovation. And all these windows, which were designed in, were also designed to become doors into the stacks whenever the time came for the stacks to be built. So it was all done with future infill in mind. That happened sooner than anticipated. It's a bird's eye view of the rotunda, taken just a few months ago, post-renovation. Ground level view. The renovation, this was the historic space, the most historic space in the building, so the renovation dealt carefully with what happened here. We removed the steps that used to be in the foreground here to make it handicapped accessible. We moved the Declaration of Independence off to the left, all 4 pages of the Constitution now on permanent display, and off to the right, the Bill of Rights. We went to the same quarries that were used for the original marble to infill the floor space where the steps used to be. St. Genevieve gold marble was used for the shrine area and different types of marble, and that's St. Genevieve is a suburb of St. Louis, and the floor area, the marble came from Tennessee. And here's new marble being fabricated in Tennessee for a door surround, like the type you see here on this level of the building, like heading towards the Learning Center or into the new rotunda openings. The chief architect at the time was Mario Boiardi, B-O-I-A-R-D-I, who literally is an heir to the Chef Boyardee family. And he was a wonderful architect. During the project, he left and took a job with a firm in Baltimore. This is at the quarry. He's pouring water on top of the marble, which is how you get the true color. Notice it's a reddish tone, and when you're next in the rotunda, look at the red circles, and that's the marble that was used for the new circles that were put in where the steps used to be. We took out the existing display cases because they were too tall for people in wheelchairs. They were too tall for little people. That's 2 of my sons. In fact, Thomas, you're here. I didn't mean to call you little. Thomas is a tall Blondo now. So we surveyed people to find out what would be a better alternative. Fido is not here, is he? One of our staff members made this mock-up of a display case, which can be elevated to different heights. The display angle of the document can be altered. And in the end, we came up with what is now in use in the rotunda, which is 25 degrees display height, display angle, and 28 inches off the ground from the front. This is the program that was used when the cornerstone was laid in 1933. Herbert Hoover wanted his name on the cornerstone. And so within days of the end of his presidency, back in those days the presidency ended, the inauguration took place on March 4th. This was February 20th. There was a ceremony. The moat wall was not finished yet. The building wasn't ready for the cornerstone, but he got his cornerstone. And more power to him, because he was an advocate to the archives as well. And in his remarks, he said, "This temple of our history will appropriately be one of the most beautiful buildings in America, an expression of the American soul." That cornerstone is the only place where John Russell Pope's name appears. It was supposed to appear here on the west wall of Pennsylvania Avenue lobby. That was supposed to have bronze lettering that named all the key people involved with building the building and the fact that it was built during the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the patron saint of the archives. This was during the Depression. And the government saved money by not putting some of the final embellishments that the architect called for, including his name in 2 places in the building. Personally, before I retire, I'd like to see a little plaque put in the lobby here to John Russell Pope, just to pay proper tribute. The other wall was supposed to have a bronze letter description of what an archives is, and the renovation wound up putting in the name of the building. No time to talk about, although in some places it was advertised, I'm talking about architectural history. There's no time to talk about the architecture. Celebrities in the National Archives building. Got Albert Einstein, his declaration of intention to become a U.S. citizen. Got a guy named Jules Brenner with hair. Eventually became Yul Brenner. Mary Pickford. I'm struggling to make this relevant to younger people, so she was the Julia Roberts of her day. Ansel Adams, a famous photographer who took astounding photographs of the American West, which are part of the holdings of the National Archives, because he did that for the government. Bob Hope. I titled my talk, If These Walls Could Talk. In effect, they do. Anybody see anything there? Does it look like Bob Hope? The walls talk to me. I see patterns in the marble veins, and they just jump out at me. I wish I had been here when Bob Hope came, because I would have loved to show him his image in marble. This is in front of room 109, by the way. This is in front of room 101. You see anything there? Snoopy. I turned them around here and enlarged them. Snoopy without a head. Can only go so far. It's marble after all. There's fossils throughout the marble in this building. This is a prominent location right inside the Pennsylvania Avenue door on the left. I don't remember the name of that fossil. It's some Latin thing. Next time I give the talk, I'll have time to look it up and find out. Gone with the Wind. That's David Selznick presenting a copy of Gone with the Wind in 1939 to the archives. Good promotion. There's a story here. I have no idea what it is. But I believe that's cellulose acetate. We used to have beauty pageants in the federal government. It's the early 1960s. If any of you know Fran Brooks, it's Fran Brooks right there. I don't know who the winner was, but she wore a crown. Or maybe that's a hat. Looks like a crown, doesn't it? Bicentennial, 1976. Our steps put to amazing use by majorettes. McGowan Theater, June 2006. Literally within weeks of the completion of that theater, floodwaters came. Building was inundated. Dehumidification took place immediately. There's an archives hero who's in our audience today. It's Tim Edwards, our facility manager. While his own home basement was flooding, he left to take care of the building and did a service to the nation. And if mildew had started to form on the records in our stacks because of the dehumidification and lack of power, we'd be toast. So a true American hero. Thank you, Tim. We re-encased the Charters of Freedom as part of the renovation. Here's Rick Judson in the back, and in the front left is a member of the National Institute of Standards and Technology who built the new cases. If I'm knowing this correctly, this is a gentleman who actually worked on the original encasements in 1951, and he played a role with the new encasements, and here they are. And here it is, it's popularized in National Treasure. Mr. Cage comes to Washington. He came and scoped out the declaration preparatory to filming. We would not allow them to film inside the rotunda because it was nearing completion for opening, and we didn't want a Hollywood film crew in there to maybe break things and scratch things. So they built the rotunda on a soundstage, and part of what I told them was there's statuary niches. Next time you see the film, you'll see statues in those niches. And so they made it even better than the original rotunda is. They didn't want their pictures taken. That's a Disney photographer who, when I first saw them come in, he gave me one of these because I had my camera. I went. And then after a while, I said, the heck with it. John Turtletaub, the director of National Treasure on the left, Archivist John Carlin in the center, then Archivist John Carlin, and Jerry Bruckheimer, the producer on the right. and the $1 million shot. The archivist and me made it impossible for me to use my flash because that would violate my archival blood, and so it's a little bit fuzzy because my hand moved. I should have used the flash. Remember I showed you the pediment roof? This is during the renovation. It was architect Mario Biardi, the renovation project manager Pat Alexander, and Marv Schenkler, who was a consultant to the building renovation. So here's what the view is like from the roof, which is known technically as Tier 22. These are zoomed in some with the camera, but you get a sense of the vista, which is available only from there. First letter requesting employment, October 19th, 1933. It's a personnel clerk named William Guest who was interested in coming back to the D.C. area, heard about the building, putting a good word in for himself. I don't know if he was ever hired or not. Congressionals. To the citizens seated here who are not directly acquainted with the federal government, this is a secret weapon. If you have a grievance with any government activity, write to your congressman, because then they write to us, and federal agencies stop the presses, and it's dealt with within 10 days. Not necessarily the resolution you seek, but at least a good answer from the government. This is a Congress member who was saying she represents New Jersey, they have clay products, we're building a building, use her stuff. I was amazed before ground was broken. Virtually every congressman wrote to the Treasury Department. We have marble in our area. We have limestone in our area. We have pipes. We have blah, blah, blah. This was during the Depression. Hire our folks. What may have been, or is it what might have been? Any editors here? I struggled with that. I'll just read you a little snippet here. According to Pope's new suggestions, the location of the administration portion of the building is changed from the south side to the Pennsylvania Avenue side of the building, the exhibition hall and accompanying lobby remaining on the south side. In order to obtain this result, certain other modifications are made to the plan, including the fact that stack elevators would now only be on the west and the east side, no longer on the north side. So it could have been a different building than what many of you know. A granite-clad building saved costs that cost to John Russell Pope. He made the case the architect's fees were based on the total building cost. And when the government decided to go mostly with limestone, rather than completely clad in granite, they saved $1.1 million. And his percentage of that, which I think may have been 10%, was lost. He made a strong case. The government answered him back in typical government manner, citing the regulations and saying basically, I'm sorry, you're out of luck. 2 people died while this building was under construction. One of whom, Charles Campbell, right here it says, this is a doctor's statement, a steel beam slid off a truck, pinning the patient between the end of the beam and the brick wall. This was at the loading dock entrance where the rampway leads into the dock, and a beam slipped off a truck and killed him. There's an eyewitness account here about it. And this gentleman, Roy Cheek, his name is shown here. I'll read you the statement from the witness. I do hereby state that on Saturday, about 2:20 p.m., I was standing on the 10th tier and was taking boards away from the men in the floor below. Cheek was helping to rip up a scaffold. This is the elevator chase, the elevator areaway on between Tier 9 and 10. He was standing on the runway. He was bending down to get a board, and he must have missed his hold as he stepped backwards and he fell off the runway. He fell into the sub-basement. This says basement. The other another account says sub-basement. About 62 feet. Cheek has a wife and 4 children. Cheek was blind in one eye. OSHA would not allow that today, somebody like that. The architects looked at the underside of the Constitution Avenue steps and they said, you know, we can put parking here if we lengthen some walls, and it's close to the front door of the building, and so they recommended they would do it. They thought it was such a good idea, they proceeded with the design without approval. And we did put parking in for a time, and now there's a theater there instead. Dirty birds, huge problem with starlings, bird droppings. Every time they tried to clean it up, it would get worse and worse. Is Constance Burr here? Okay. Constance did a thesis during the renovation on Guastavino tile, which is a special fireproof tile that was used in the 1800s and early 1900s, and some of it is in this building. Got a call out of the blue. She wanted to come and take a look. I showed her some, and toward the end of the renovation, we actually gave her a piece of it that had fallen off as part of a little bit of demolition work. Tim actually gave it to her, and her reaction was pleased. She was very pleased. Protecting the public's dollar. Auditors came on board, and they found out that the train fare was billed at $1 more than what the cheapest rate was. And so John Russell Pope's shop says right down here, we're enclosing a check in the amount of $1 to cover the difference in the amount billed. A national shrine, and the point of this is to say that Pope had an elevated vision for this building. It was more than a storehouse of records. It would be a national shrine to our nation, and he succeeded in doing that. Pneumatic tubes. There was a tube system throughout the building where pull slips can be sent from the central control desk in the central research room up to the branch chief offices on the east and west sides. Pope also said early on, in regard to the pneumatic tubes, we're under the impression that some mention has been made of connecting the archives building to other buildings with such a tube for transmission of documents. Is this correct? The answer was no, it was not correct. Pope wanted the building to look great, and he implored that professional stone carvers do the work rather than at the quarry. No time to get into it, but that's what that's about. Bob Raffaelli, stoneworker. We have pictures of him in our holdings putting on gold stars, which were on marble surrounds around the Declaration, etching the words here. A young man, buff. He was alive during the renovation, and I did my best to try to get him here when the rotunda was reopened in 2003. Without success, alas. He died in 2005. Two of his three daughters came by for a tour a couple of years ago, and I showed them what we had dismantled yet kept, and that brought tears to their eyes. That's what their dad had done. One of the first DC buildings to be air-conditioned was this place. Locked drawers. I have here on the table in the central research room, there were drawers inside the areas that people work with the records on. Two of them were locked. When it came time to demolish them, we pulled out the drawers by unlocking them and found they were time capsules. There's paperwork in there from the early 1960s from researchers who had been hired by other researchers to do work on their behalf. So they never got an answer to their letters, but they became part of the building's history. For the 50th anniversary, we had a postage stamp done, and we couldn't do it for the 75th because the Postal Service regulations don't allow for that increment. It's 50, 100, 150. For a while, because we thought about doing it for the 75th, and during the 50th, after the effort went forth, the archives hadn't heard anything for quite a while, so the person who was on point for that inquired and found out that our package never got delivered. It was lost in the mail. Although he had never received formal parachute training, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe volunteered to jump with the first wave. I believe that's, well, I'm not going to say for sure, the first wave, for which action he was recommended for promotion. During the Battle of the Bulge, McAuliffe received the Distinguished Service Medal for leading the epic defense of the town of Bastogne during attack by overwhelming German forces. When asked by the German general to surrender, this was Christmas Eve, 1944, he responded with the now famous one-word answer, nuts. Bastogne was saved. Within, and that's a picture of General McAuliffe, within days of the German surrender document, it was brought to the rotunda, and he unveiled it. Same with General Wainwright, who was captured by the Japanese. We were the focal point of the nation during those times. Here's the research room before renovation. Here it is post-renovation. This is a building that has stood the test of time. And even in a day of electronic records, which can seem so ephemeral, there still is a place for this Temple of Clio and for original records in traditional forms, not just paper. And I'm sorry, I've only left you 5 minutes for questions. Are there any questions? Yes.
Did Pope design the building to use the interior courtyard for record storage, or did that develop later?
Yes, it was designed with future growth in mind. By all means, he did that, and it just had to be infilled sooner than expected. Good question. Yes.
Why no windows?
The building was designed to be a vault, and then the record storage areas, light causes a problem. He knew enough. The building started in 1930-31, but the archives wasn't formed until 34. And some decisions right toward the end were held for the Archivist of the United States. The very first decision he made was to, and this was R.W.D. Connor, who was a history professor at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The first decision he made had to do with the projection equipment for the movie theater. He also made a decision regarding some of the inscriptions, some of which never got put in. Other questions? Yes?
Compared to 400 people that were employed then, how many was now employed?
Close to 3,000 nationwide. We have about 44 buildings nationwide. Still a relatively small agency by government standards, but a lot of buildings because of the records.
Will all congressional records eventually end up here, and what will accommodate all the future growth of all those documents?
Only about 2 to 3% of all federal records have permanent value. So the vast majority of all records are destroyed at some point. Congressional records, it's probably a higher percentage than that just because of the nature. Anybody here from Center for Congressional can speak to that? Can speak to that, Ron?
We accept what Congress sends us.
Yes, whatever Congress wants to send us, we take and we salute because they fund us. So
Besides what's
there's a thing called an appraisal archivist, which was my first National Archives job, and they work with federal agencies in the here and now to help determine what has permanent value and what can be destroyed at some point. It's not on a document-by-document basis. It's on a series of records basis, like the correspondence files of the Secretary of Defense would be permanently valuable, for instance. You kind of touched potentially on the idea of electronic records, and we have a huge effort underway to deal with the electronic records issue. Lockheed Martin has a very large contract. They have about 7 years or so to come up with a system that will make access to electronic records available independent of software and independent of hardware that the records were originally created in. So it doesn't exist yet, and it's the panacea if they succeed. If they don't succeed, we run the risk of being the archives of the 20th century and earlier, and then the nation suffers because ultimately it's access to the records of government for a good democracy to function. So, yes. Yes. You, sir.
I'm intrigued by the photograph that you had of the moat structure and the initial design and structure of the building, and I gather that went away with the renovations.
Good question.
Was there ever any flooding before the recent?
The north side of the building, the moat there was infilled with office space, but there's a gap between the floor of the office space and the moat floor, so water can still collect and accumulate under that. The south side, the moat was interrupted in that the theater is actually literally under the steps, and the moat is a little bit inward from that. But we put walls up for emergency access doors, et cetera, for the theater. But other than that, the moat still exists on the south side. I didn't have time to scan it, but we have some photographs from 1935 while the building was still under construction. There was a hurricane that came through. It's the hurricane that formed the inlet in Ocean City, Maryland, just at the end of Ocean City and Assateague. Huge rainstorm came in, and 7th and 9th Street rampways were barricaded with enormous beams. I want to say, how big were they, Tim? Like a foot by foot. They were huge, medieval-looking beams. and sandbags to keep the water out. Have there been floods prior to 2006? Any word on that, Tim? Nothing like 2006. Yeah.
We're actually right now. We are installing floodgates on both 7th and 9th Street, where 06 flood, Constitution flood, backed up 07 and 9th.
Yeah, Tim is pointing out we're putting in floodgates on 7th and 9th Street to remedy, as a remedy measure should other floodwaters come. Other questions? Yes?
What kind of finding aid is there, Rick, for the materials about the construction of the building, in case any of us wanted to look into some of the things that you...
There's two series of records. One is the general construction files, Record Group 121, which is the Public Building Service. And I forget, I want to say maybe there's 18 Hollinger boxes or so. And then there's another series, see me afterwards because I have the citation in my satchel here, of general correspondence, which is an augmentation to those. Those are the two major series of records. In addition to those paper records, there's photographs and there's motion picture film. And then there's the records of the National Archives as a federal entity, Record Group 64. That happens after we were built, and it documents the history of the agency. Any other questions? Yes?
You didn't have a stamp for the 75th anniversary. Did you publish or mint a coin or a token?
We actually looked into a coin, a medallion from the U.S. Congress, and that failed because there's always more need than there is availability, more requests than there is availability. Other questions? All right, I'm planning on repeating this at the College Park building at a date not yet set. So if some of your colleagues wanted to come and couldn't, spread the word. Thank you very much for your interest in coming. Tim.